Hej Ulla-Karin. Vi ska börja på Cameo 29 idag som handlar om Jambisk pentameter. Men innan vi läser så skriver vi ner en bön så får vi se om vi får något svar under läsningen av den bönen. Så, Cameo 29 av 32. Jambisk pentameter. The section, The Christ in You, in chapter 24 of the text, can be regarded as the beginning of consistent jambic pentameter in the text. From here, it is more or less continuous for the rest of the text. Then it picks up in the workbook in lesson 98, after which it runs unbroken to the end of the workbook. In the
Förlåt,
manual.
Anna. Alltså min koppling släppte här. Jag vet inte riktigt vad det är texten, men har du lust att ta om det från början?
Jag kan ta om det från början.
Ja, tack.
Jambisk pentameter. Jag tror man säger pentameter på engelska. Så det blir lite svensk engelska. The section, This Christ in You, in chapter 24 in the text, can be regarded as the beginning of consistent jambic pentameter in the text. From here, it is more or less continuous for the rest of the text. It then picks up in the workbook in lesson 98, after which it runs unbroken to the end of the workbook. In the manual, it is used only in selected passages of special importance. Jambisk pentameter is a fundamental building block of English poetry. It is most prominently associated with William Shakespeare, who wrote both plays and poetry in it. But it has been standard, literally, convention from before Shakespeare up to the present day. To understand jambic pentameter, you only have to understand two things. First, the basic unit is a two-syllable foot, which in this case consists of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, such as the word before. Second, a line of jambic pentameter consists of 5 such feet. As a result, a line will sound like a series of heartbeats. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. We can hear these 5 heartbeats in the famous line from Shakespeare. If music be the food of love, play on. A writer need not be a slave to this exact structure, however. Poets will often skillfully diverge from strict jambic pentameter as Shakespeare himself did. Discovering where the jambic pentameter starts in the course can be tricky, since anything written in English will naturally have occasional lines fall into jambic pentameter. However, in the early sections of chapter 24, one can see passages that seem to quite intentionally employ this form. For example, In the final paragraph of section 3, we find these sentences which fit the form perfectly. They ask of you, but that you will be done. They seek your love, that you may love yourself. Love not your specialness instead of them. The print of nails is on your hands as well. The frequency of such examples increases until the final 4 paragraphs of section 6 are mostly in Jambisk pentameter. Finally, section 5, the Christ in you, is an unusual poetic section with concrete imagery that is both moving. He sings to them from heaven that their ears may hear no more the sounds of battle and of death. And at times, jarring, for example, there is the graphic image of a rotting corpse with flesh already loosened from the bones. It is in this poetic section that the text begins its continuous use of poetic verse. At this early stage, the Jambisk pentameter is quite rough, with around a quarter of the lines not fitting in strict form. However, it gets smoother and smoother until by the time we reach chapter 27, it's nearly perfect and remains so for the rest of the text. Helen loved Shakespeare as well as other great English poets. As a young person, she even had dreams of being a great poet. The question naturally arises then, was Helen herself the source of the Jambisk pentameter? Was she somehow taking the ideas that Jesus passed on to her and rendering them into words that fit the Jambisk pentameter? Or was the material instead being received by her in a form that already fit the meter? We can safely say it was the latter. For one, it seems clear that in the very earliest sections of the Jambisk pentameter, Helen did not notice it was there. We say that because she often made little changes in wording that actually broke the meter. Here are 2 such changes from the Christ in you, which each line being a line of Jambisk pentameter and the words in brackets representing the new wording that she read into the urtext. That you have not, he is in your eyes, your ears. You thought you saw in you, within yourself, his holiness. In both cases, the original line fit the meter, while the changed version did not. Later on, Helen valued the Jambisk pentameter so much that she would closely monitor any lack of it, any lack of fit, so she could correct it. It is therefore hard to imagine that she would knowingly do the exact opposite here, take lines that fit the meter and correct them so they no longer fit. We can safely conclude then that when the Jambisk pentameter first started coming through, Helen didn't notice its presence. Ken Wapnick reported this same thing, saying, this, the Jambisk pentameter, was unknown to Helen at first, but after a while she realized the words were coming in a definite rhythm. However, by the chapter later, chapter 25, section 4, Helen had clearly noticed the Jambisk pentameter. We can see this on the pages of her notebooks, where she marked the division between the Jambisk pentameter lines with double quotation marks. Here is an example from textbook 25:8. Notice the double quotation marks after comes in the first line, sanity in the second line, and hope in the third line. This was Helen's way at this point of marking the line divisions in the Jambisk pentameter. This raises a question that is similar to the earlier one. Just as we asked whether the Jambisk pentameter came from Helen or Jesus, we now need to ask if Helen figured out where the line breaks fell, or if she received those line breaks from Jesus. The most natural explanation would seem to be the first, for it would not have been difficult for Helen to simply count off the 5 feet and then insert her little quotation mark. This would have been especially easy to do after the fact. Go back in, count out the syllables, and note the line divisions. There are, however, serious problems with the idea that Helen herself decided where the line breaks should go. The first one is that at this stage in the Jambisk pentameter, as we note above, it is quite rough, about a quarter of the lines not fitting the meter. The effect of this is that there are a number of different ways to break the lines in a given paragraph. For example, let's look at one of the paragraphs in question. There is the final paragraph of chapter 25. The miracle that you receive, you give. Each one becomes an illustration of the law on which salvation rests. That justice must be done to all. If anyone is to be healed, no one can lose, everyone must benefit. Each miracle is an example of what justice can accomplish when it is offered to everyone alike. It is received and given equally. It is awareness that giving and receiving are the same, because it does not make the same unlike. It sees no difference where none exists, and thus it is the same for everyone, because it sees no differences in them. Its offering is universal, and it teaches but one message. What is God's belongs to everyone and is his due. There are many ways to divide the lines of Jambisk pentameter in this paragraph. The first sentence is easy. It fits the meter perfectly, but not long after that we get into trouble. What follows is one way to speak the lines in this paragraph, with those that do not fit the meter render in boldface. The miracle that you receive, you give. Each one becomes an illustration of the law on which salvation rests, that justice must be done to all. If anyone is to be healed, no one can lose, and everyone must benefit. Each miracle is an example of what justice can accomplish when it is offered to everyone alike. It is received and given equally. It is awareness that giving and receiving are the same, because it does not make the same unlike. It sees no differences where none exists. And thus it is the same for everyone, because it sees no differences in them. Its offering is universal, and it teaches but one message. What is God's belongs to everyone and is his due. This is not a very satisfying arrangement, since 8 of the lines do not fit to the meter. So we tried 3 other arrangements. One had 10 lines that did not fit, one had 8. And the final one, we got down to 5. The latter arrangement, however, was not preferable because one of its lines contained stresses that were badly off, which is worse than the number of syllables being off. As you can imagine, it can take a lot of time to try out these different arrangements and compare them to other to see which is best. Yet perhaps this is exactly what Helen was doing, going off, trying out different arrangements, selecting the best, and then going back in and inserting the quotation marks. We can, however, say with confidence that this was not happening. Helen was inserting the line breaks as she took the dictation. We say this for a simple reason. The gaps between words are longer when her double quotation marks are present. You can see this in the sample we included above. If you cover up the quotation marks with your finger, you can see that where the quotation marks are present, there is a larger than normal gap between the words. We have tested this visual impression, having carefully measured more than 400 gaps between words. In paragraph after paragraph, we find a consistent result. The gaps between the words that include Helen's quotation marks are more than 50% longer than normal gaps. The only explanation for such consistent result is that she was writing those marks while taking the dictation. How else could those marks have taken up extra space, moving over the words that follow them? And this can only mean one thing. Jesus was somehow communicating to Helen where the line division should go. While the Jambisk pentameter is rough, there is simply no way to know where the breaks should go without having the entire paragraph in front of you and seeing the effect of your decision on the lines that follow. In other words, to do it optimally, you have to know what is coming later in the paragraph. To demonstrate this, let's look at how Jesus, for we can safely say it was Jesus, divided the lines in that sample paragraph we looked at earlier. The miracle that you receive, you give. Each one becomes an illustration of the law of which salvation rests, that justice must be done to all if anyone is to be healed. No one can lose, and everyone must benefit. Each miracle is an example of what justice can accomplish when it is offered to everyone alike. It is received and given equally. It is awareness that giving and receiving are the same, because it does not make the same unlike. It sees no difference where none exists. And thus it is the same for everyone, because it sees no difference in them. Its offering is universal, and it teaches but one message. What is God's belongs to everyone and is his due. Notice how much more elegant Jesus' solution to the Jambisk pentameter is in this paragraph, with only 4 lines that do not fit the meter. See lines in bold. Notice also that he accomplishes this by sacrificing lines that on their own could fit the meter perfectly, but once sacrificed will make what follows fit better. His first sacrifice in the very first sentence, which is a sentence of perfect Jambisk pentameter. It may not occur to someone to break up that sentence. Why do so? But it turns out that making this seemingly unnecessary sacrifice at the beginning is the key to making the rest of the paragraph work best. Also, the 3rd and 4th lines that don't fit could have fit without a hitch, offered to everyone alike. It is received and given equally. It is. Yet, they too are sacrificed for what is coming. By sacrificing them, he avoids the line mentioned earlier, in which the stresses are jarringly off awareness that giving and receiving. We have spent a good deal of time on this fairly technical discussion because it actually affords one of our best windows onto the mechanics of the dictation. We first established that Jesus dictated large portions of the course to Helen in Jambisk pentameter, requiring him to control both the number of syllables and the stresses in those syllables. He did this even before she was aware of him doing so. We then established that Jesus somehow communicated to Helen where the line breaks should go. Finally, we observed that he could only have done this based on a verbatim knowledge of what was coming later in the paragraph. This last point is particularly significant. In the early chapters of the dictation process, one has the impression that Jesus is speaking to Helen extemporaneously. Jag vet inte vad det betyder. Se om jag kan räkna ut det. Aha, extemporant. Nej. Ja. As any normal speaker would, since he and she often go back and forth in brief dialogues. As normal speakers, we have only a vague idea of what we are going to say next, with perhaps an occasional phrase that is pre-planned. We only know all of the exact words we will say when we are reading a prepared speech. In these later chapters, Jesus seems to be doing something very much like that. It is as if he is reading from a finished document. He appears to know with perfect accuracy the exact words he is going to dictate to Helen in the coming sentences. He seems to have the entire paragraph before him, complete in every word and complete with line divisions for the Jambisk pentameter. This would actually explain one of Helen's main observations about the dictation process. The writing was highly interruptible. At the office, I could lay the notebook down to answer the telephone, talk to a patient, supervise a junior staff member, or attend to one of our numerous emergencies and return to the writing without even checking back to see where I left off. At home, I could talk to my husband, chat with a friend, or take a nap, going back to the notebook afterwards without disturbing the flow of words in the slightest. It did not matter whether I had stopped at the end of a paragraph or in the middle of a sentence. It was as if the voice merely waited until I came back and then started again. Bill described the highly interruptible nature of the scribing by saying, the material was there almost as if it had been pre-recorded and was waiting for her attention. All of this sounds very much like what we have just concluded. It is as if Jesus was dictating from an already composed original. This is a particularly surprising finding, given our experience of how normal speaking works. No one, except perhaps an autistic savant, carries around word for word speeches in his or her head and then recites them from memory. Yet, that appears to be what Jesus did with Helen, at least in these later chapters. On the other hand, perhaps this explanation inappropriately assumes that Jesus is within linear time. The Course's teaching claims that he is outside of linear time. And what we may be seeing here is actually evidence that this is true, that he was speaking to Helen from a place outside of time in which there was an all at oneness to the process. A paragraph, in other words, was perhaps composed all at once rather than through a linear process. And then from that place of simultaneity, he merely fed the material to Helen, one word at a time. Perhaps, then, what we are observing here is a tiny, concrete clue as to the timelessness of the place from which the Course originated. Whatever the explanation, it is clear that Jesus put an immense amount of precise planning into the Jambisk pentameter. He clearly wanted the Course to not just be a series of abstract ideas, but also to be poetry. And the reason for this is not particularly mysterious. After all, the emotional impact of poetry all allows our minds and hearts to unexpected stumble into new places that would otherwise remain closed to us. In short, poetry moves us. And that is precisely Jesus' goal in the Course, to move our hearts and minds into fundamentally new territory. Så vad väcker den här cameon hos oss? Jag har hela tiden tänkt att Jesus dikterar utanför tiden och att det inte var en linjär form av diktering alls. Och att det var därför som hon kunde... Hon avbröt ju mitt i en mening och sen bara fortsatte att skriva. Och jag vet att Hemingway gjorde faktiskt likadant. Han avbröt jag kommer inte ihåg tiderna, men det var, han hade en speciell tid, 5:00 säger vi, det kanske var 4:00 eller 3:00, men han hade en bestämd tid som han skrev fram till, och det spelar ingen roll om han var mitt i en mening. När klockan slog 5, säger vi då, så avbröt han och sen fortsatte han bara att skriva. Jag har ju gått många författarkurser och skrivit en hel del och praktiserar inte mitt i en mening. Jag avbryter eller avslutar meningarna i alla fall. Men att det går att fortsätta att skriva, och också att jag behöver inte läsa vad jag skrivit tidigare, utan jag bara fortsätter och skriver. Och det är ju olika för olika författare. Ibland ser man bilder som man beskriver, ibland får man ord för ord. Jag har haft precis det här. Jag får bara ord för ord, ett ord i taget får jag. Och jag är så fascinerad att det blir någonting begripligt av det. Men det är väldigt tydligt att jag behöver ju inte veta. Jag behöver verkligen inte veta. Och det är det som jag upplever att han beskriver här. Helen visste verkligen ingenting. Vad väcker det hos dig?
Ja, alltså jag är ju så fascinerad av det här och tycker det är väldigt spännande liksom hur det har gått till och hur det kunde ha gått till som det gjorde och så, men jag har svårt, alltså jag ser inte det här versmåttet i texten. Jag kan inte säga att det är skrivet på det jambiska versmåttet och det är inte skrivet. Jag kan inte urskilja det. Kan du det? När du läser
Eh,
texten?
ja, så jag urskiljer nog inte, men jag känner det. Jag
Ja,
känner hjärtslagen. Och nu i den här, alltså, jag kan verkligen känna skillnaden i att läsa det Jesus har eh, talat om, hur eh, radmatningarna ska se ut. Och det är samma sak med, eh, det spelar ingen roll om det är en text så här, eller om det är att välja blommor eller köpa mat. Jag kan känna liksom vartåt heligande Jesus pekar. Det bara känns gott.
ja, jo, men det kan nog vara lite så.
Mm.
Jag vet att det är ju länge sedan nu som jag började lyssna på, det var ju långt innan jag träffade dig, så som jag lyssnade på David när han läste lektion 109, I
Mm.
rest in God. Och där kände jag ju detta. Det var bara så vackert. Och jag lyssnade och lyssnade och lyssnade på den där lektionen hur mycket som helst. Jag fick aldrig nog på något vis. Och det var väl det som väckte att det blev lite, att jag blev nyfiken. Eh, för först tänkte jag att det var bara innehållet som tilltalade mig, det var det väl också, men just att det var så vackert, att känslan.
Mm. Mm.
Jag har ju ingen erfarenhet att skriva så på det viset själv. Jag har ju bara skrivit juridiska. Ja, där kan man inte tillämpa det, tror jag inte. Men i min ungdom så tyckte jag om att skriva. Alltså som tonåring så skrev jag ibland. När jag var ledsen och så kunde jag skriva om min känslor. Men sen förlorade jag det då när jag studerade. För då blev jag ju liksom inskolad i det här andra sättet. Jag har inte kunnat komma tillbaka till det riktigt.
Mm.
Men det är lite synd, för det är liksom en gåva att kunna
Mm.
skriva ner sina tankar och känslor.
Mm.
Nej, men som sagt, jag är fascinerad av hur det här gick till och att det kan vara så. Och det här att hon kunde återuppta den när som helst. Och, ja, det är ju liksom magic alltihopa på något vis. Och det är det ju. Ja, vad ska man säga? Det är spännande.
Mm. Och jag kan verkligen relatera till eh, att poesi verkligen öppnar upp någonting mellan orden. Jag har ju studerat det senaste året bibliopoesiterapi och praktiserat väldigt mycket. Eh, och hur Jag känner igen det i kursen. Mitt avslutningsarbete skriver jag om en kurs i Mirakler och det jobb som vi gör där med bibel- och poesiterapi. Jag fick ju cancer mitt uppe i alltihop, så jag har inte skrivit klart den än, men nu ska jag snart skriva klart den. Så kan jag dela med mig av,
Ja,
av den. Att för mig är det fullkomligt klart att den här kursen är skriven på det sättet där det är egentligen utrymmet mellan orden, eller det orden pekar på, det som är bortom orden, som gör det här att vi känner igen det. Att den är skriven på det sättet. Många gånger så det kan ju vara en mening eller ett stycke, man förstår ju orden men man förstår inte innebörden, man känner ju det. Och det tar ett tag och man får läsa långsamt och man får skriva, tycker jag ju om, och det gör vi ju nu på morgonmötena, för att komma åt det helt enkelt. Men det är som att den här kursen vecklar ut sig som en dahlia.
ja, det tar aldrig slut heller. Det bara växer, känns det som. Ibland. Och så
Verkligen.
ska jag tänka då, man lyssnar på en sån som Kit Kavanagh, då jag vet inte om du brukar lyssna på honom.
Oh ja, jag brukar lyssna
Ja.
på honom.
Då är det ju liksom, betyder det inte så mycket då. Det är bara pang, pang, pang. Han drar ju liksom ur essensen av det hela bara i några meningar och så, ja, så är det.
Ja, precis.
Det är himla härligt på något vis, samtidigt då som man ser det andra. Ja,
Mm.
det är spännande.
Vi hinner börja på nästa Cameo, läsa lite grann i alla fall. Det är Cameo 30. As you see him, you will see yourself. What do you do when your professional responsibilities seems to conflict with your spiritual path? This, broadly speaking, is the question answered by a short piece of guidance that Helen received from Jesus on June 19, 1968, near the end of the process of her receiving the text. The professional responsibility in question was psychological testing, including the diagnosis of patients. Psychological tests were highly relevant for Helen and Bill. We see two of the tests familiar to them crop up in the dictation itself. In chapter 1, Helen mentions the Roche test, the Roche's response of footprints to the top read on 2. The well-known test in which a subject's perception of 10 ink blots is analyzed in order to identify personality characteristics and even thought disorder. Jesus several times mentions the sentence completion test, in which subjects are presented with the beginning of a sentence called a stem and asked to complete the sentence any way they like. Responses are believed to reveal the subject's attitudes, beliefs, fantasies, and emotional conflicts. In addition, Bill and Helen were deeply involved with the personality assessment system, a highly sophisticated tool for measuring a person's personality type along 3 different dimensions: intellectual, procedural, and social interpersonal. Bill and Helen worked for many years with its originator, John Gittinger, helping him develop the path, performing research, writing academic papers, and in Bill's case, teaching. Indeed, according to Gittinger, Helen considered the path her primary professional work until 1975. Here is what Bill said about paths. By using the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scales and sophisticated psychometry, an individual's personality can be defined as his behavior predicted with extraordinary accuracy. In fact, after working with the past, I thought John Gittinger had designed the most powerful descriptive and predictive system in the world for assessing personality. I also felt that as a personality assessment and predictive tool, the past ranked with the discoveries of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung in psychology. Wow, vi får läsa mer om det nästa gång. Jag vet att, jag ska se om jag hittar igen den boken. Ja, det var inte den. Jag hittar inte igen den. Här. Nu ska vi se. Den här, Please Understand Me Too. Det här är också en personlighetstest som Bill senare använde, vet jag. Jag har samma personlighetskategorisering som Bill. Och det var så intressant när jag läste Carol House bok, kan sluta dela. Så tänkte jag när jag läste om honom, alltså jag har alltid känt mycket för Bill. Jag tänkte när jag läste den här att vi måste ju ha samma. Det är väldigt få, det är strax över 2,7% eller någonting som har den här personlighetstypen. Vi verkar extroverta men är introverta till exempel.
Vad heter det?
Jag tyckte det var jätteroligt att läsa. Vilken ville du ha båda?
Nej, men vad heter personlighetstestet?
Det här, det bygger på en jungiansk grund. The Kursey Temperament Sorter. David Kursey. Ja, och Bill var ju jätteinvolverad i personlighetstestning tidigt. Väldigt tidigt. Han jobbar ju för CIA eller FBI, jag kommer inte ihåg. Och jobbade med personlighetstester. Mm.
Ja, de var ju psykologer båda två.
De var ju det. Och forskningspsykologer, liksom. Väldigt forskningsinriktade. Mm. Vi läser mer om det nästa gång. Vi ska se om det kanske blir redan nästa vecka. Eller om det blir... Jodå, jag kan den 12:e.
Det kan nog däremot inte jag. Och sitter hos frissan.
Se om någon annan kan.
Men du spelar in det här?
Ja, men jag läser inte själv. Jag behöver en dialog för att det ska vara intressant överhuvudtaget. Så jag läser inte själv. Det krävs att någon annan är med. Vad sa du?
Visar du texten så jag kan läsa själv? Alltså, delar du texten?
Jag delar texten medan jag läser. Du har sett texten nu, eller hur?
Ja.
Ja, precis.
Men du gör inte det om du inte läser, så att säga?
Nej, jag kan inte dela bara texten. Det kan jag köpte den som en Kindle-bok och det går inte att dela på det sättet. Det är inte en pdf.
Nej.
Utan det är en bok. Man får köpa boken själv helt enkelt om man vill.
Ja. Du, Anna, får jag passa på att fråga, vågar man det? Hur går din kropp nu?
Jag tänker att jag spelar in just nu så jag kan svara på det efteråt. Ja. Så vi tittar på vår bön. Har vi fått något svar? Jag känner att jag verkligen har fått svar. Jag frågade helige Ande, hur vill du använda mig nu? Och det vi har läst om är i väldigt hög grad biblioterapi. De här frågorna som man avslutar till exempel, det använder vi i biblioterapi. Så jag ska gå biblioterapi, bibliopoesiterapivägen. Det var en tydligt svar för mig.
Ja.
Fick du något svar?
Nej, jag får ju inte det. Jag vet ju inte. Jag får väl det som vanligt. Men det kändes bra och jag bad om att kunna stanna kvar i det rätta sinnet och det tyckte jag väl att jag kunde under större delen av texten. Så det kanske var så.
Mm, absolut. Då så, då avslutar jag inspelningen.